When I say I'm going to make you the smartest people in the room, I really mean that is my goal. And I want to talk about some, frankly, moronic idea that's coming out of New Hampshire entitled Guns to Gardens, and why, frankly, this is not a very good idea. And if you knew your history, you'd understand why. And I'm going to teach you that history in just 1 second. Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of the Four Boxes Diner, proud American gun owner, constitutional attorney, member of the United States Supreme Court Bar, and author of the brand new best-selling book, Disarmed: What the Ukraine War Teaches Americans About the Right to Bear Arms. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter if you're on Twitter, at Four Boxes Diner. I put a lot more Second Amendment related information out there than I can possibly get out on video. So check me out there if you haven't already. All right, folks. So to make you the smartest people in the room, which is my full intent, and I hope I'm accomplishing this, I have to sometimes connect dots and give you a lot of good history. So we're going to get a little geeky here on our history today, but I think you're going to like it quite a bit. To begin with, we're going to start off with an article that caused me to laugh out loud out of the state of New Hampshire. That's right, that's the live free or die state. The same state from one of the most famous militiamen of all times, John Stark, came from. We'll talk about him in other videos. But for now, let's just talk about this article and this story. Specifically, there was an article, which I'll put a link to down below, entitled New Hampshire's First Guns to Gardens Repurposes Unwanted Firearms. Did you hear the title of this? Guns to Gardens. Well, as soon as I saw that title, it made me laugh because, of course, I know my history about this notion of converting guns into gardens or guns into garden implements and why it's potentially extremely dangerous. But let me tell you about what's going on in New Hampshire, and then we're going to talk about some of the history dealing with this concept of giving up one's guns in exchange for farming equipment. Specifically, according to this article in the New Hampshire Union Leader out of Manchester, New Hampshire, they talk about the Guns to Gardens program and the fact that there was an event up there. And the idea, according to one of the volunteers for an organization called Gun Sense New Hampshire, is that it is apparently a project of the political action group Granite State Progress. And one of the coordinators of the Guns to Gardens program said that she herself has a heart pendant fabricated from melted down gun barrels, or from a melted down gun barrel. She goes on, according to the article at least, a very nice article by the way, saying that this notion of a melted down gun barrel into a pendant symbolized the group's mission, which is to destroy and repurpose unwanted firearms before more needless gun violence occurs. This article goes on to say, and then it quotes the volunteer, or the coordinator, quote, "We're offering the service to the gun owner of disarming the gun. They donate the scrap metal and we take it to a forge and have it transformed to things like a necklace." Goes on to say that there's a t-shirt out there, apparently, I don't know if she was wearing it, but there's a t-shirt slogan out there that says, quote, "Imagine a future without gun violence." This apparently was a rallying cry for this event and some of the work that the groups do. Now, this notion that we should, as Americans, and this is, of course, what the precedent is being set, right? That the idea is let's give up our guns and make them something, quote unquote, productive, implicitly suggesting that firearms are not productive for a civilized society, which, of course, is the polar opposite of what is true, which is firearms are extremely important. In fact, they're necessary for civilized society, especially firearms in the hands of civilians and not just government. So I want to talk a little bit about this history that actually ties in, as I see it, to this concept of converting guns into garden equipment. Specifically, there's a very famous quote that we actually don't know where it comes from originally, at least the quote I'm about to give you, but we do know kind of the source of the concept of the quote, which comes originally from actually a very famous English poet and writer by the name of Rudyard Kipling, who's also the author of something you're all familiar with, which is the book that gave rise to the Disney, I think they're Disney movies, The Jungle Book, okay? Among other things. Now, the quote that is often used on the internet, although we don't know who actually said it first, runs along these lines. It says, quote, "Those who hammer their guns into plows will plow for those who do not." I repeat, the famous quote, again, who we don't know who to attribute to originally, goes this way, quote, "Those who hammer their guns into plows will plow for those who do not." Now, this is very important because what they're saying is that if you give up your guns for other types of service equipment such as gardening equipment or farming equipment or whatnot, then the men who have guns will come and make you plow and farm for them, and you'll find yourself enslaved as a serf, as a subject, or worse of all, a slave. Because you will be disarmed, and the people with the guns will be able to lord over you. Now, this is a lesson that I'm not just telling you out of the blue. This is something our founding fathers understood, which is why, for example, Joseph Story, one of our earliest Supreme Court justices, describes the right to bear arms and the armed citizenry here in the United States as the palladium of the republic. The essential component, the essential safeguard of a republic is the armed citizens, because, of course, the government and foreign invaders, domestic insurrections, the government tyranny, whatever it is, all these things could come to pass, but it makes it much harder for you to lose your life and your freedoms if you're armed. Again, the right to bear arms and armed citizenry is just another check on governmental overreach, and that includes other efforts by the founding fathers, whether it be federalism, states' powers, whether it be bicameral legislature, separation of branches between the executive branch and the legislative branch, and of course the judiciary. All these things are about checking governmental power and protecting individual liberties, and one of them is, of course, the Bill of Rights, which includes our Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. Now, let me carry on with this notion of converting your guns into garden equipment, which I think is a terrible idea as a general matter. The idea is not just that quote that I gave you, but it also goes back again to a very famous poem. Now, we're going to get super geeky here. I'm warning you now. There's a very famous poem. There's actually several famous poems by Rudyard Kipling. Now, I have to warn you about Rudyard Kipling. Now, before we talk about this famous passage from a poem of Rudyard Kipling, I just want to warn you that the left in America does not like Rudyard Kipling for a whole bunch of reasons. I'm not going to bore you with. You can Google it and look at the controversies about him. Nevertheless, just so you're aware that the left hates this guy. But again, of course, they hate Winston Churchill and the founding fathers too. So I think Rudyard Kipling falls into that camp of people that the left generally hates and tries to memory hole so that we don't remember his work, which he was extremely important. Rudyard Kipling's poem that is right on point of this notion of guns to gardens is a poem called The Gods of Copybook Headings. The Gods of Copybook Headings. Now, your first question, of course, if you're an American like I am, is what the heck is a copybook heading? Well, it's actually quite interesting. In England, when Rudyard Kipling was growing up in the early 20th century in his schools over there, he also grew up, I think, in part of his childhood in India, by the way, but as part of the English educational system, they would teach young students handwriting in cursive. And one of the ways they did it is they would require the students to write like the same sentence like 100 times, to practice their penmanship, to practice learning how to write cursive, and so on. And what the teachers would have them write were known as copybook headings, because you would copy that sentence over and over and over again. The idea being that in addition to learning how to write, you would also learn the pearls of wisdom in these copybook headings. You know, things like a penny saved is a penny earned. These kinds of life lessons that, are the sorts of things that might give rise to copybook headings. Now, what Rudyard Kipling did is he wrote this poem really trying to say that at the end of the day, and you check the poem out yourself, there's a lot of lessons in here. But one of his big things is that no matter what happens in life, no matter how complicated life gets, no matter how rich people get or exotic people get, whatever it is, at the end of the day, that the lessons you learned as a child, learning how to write with these copybook headings, almost always come back to be true. And that's why he refers to this poem as the gods of the copybook headings, because at the end of the day, no matter what happens in your life or in a society's world, or in the world or society, the gods of the copybook headings always prevail, because it's those common sense pearls of wisdom that ultimately prove true, no matter how, again, elaborate, complex, or exotic one's life or lifestyle or society becomes. Now, one of the critical lessons that I want you to understand, and it speaks to this notion of why you really don't want your guns being converted into garden tools. You really want your guns to be there as guns for self-defense and protection and to vindicate the Second Amendment's right to keep and bear arms, which of course codifies a pre-existing right, is a famous line from this poem, The Gods of the Copybook Headings by Rudyard Kipling, a famous English writer and poet. This is what he writes. When the Cambrian measures were forming, they promised perpetual peace. They swore if we gave them our weapons, that the wars of the tribes would cease. But when we disarmed, they sold us and delivered us bound to our foe. And the gods of the copybook heading said, stick to the devil, you know. Now, that's the famous line. And of course, the critical line is that they swore that if you gave up your weapons, if you gave them our weapons, the wars of the tribes would cease. You'll have the security and protection. But of course, once you disarmed, according to the gods of the copybook headings, you were sold and bound to your foe as slaves. So this is written in 1919, by the way. And by the way, this is before the history of the 20th century really unfolded. Keep in mind that Rudyard Kipling wrote this poem in 1919, but here's the reality of it. This was before World War II. This was before Nazi Germany. In fact, Rudyard Kipling died, I believe, in the mid-1930s before all the terrible atrocities in Europe took place. We must always remember the critical work of the late R.J. Rummell, who wrote the book Statistics of Democide, Genocide and Mass Murder since 1900. And he specifically talks about those hundreds of millions of people around the world that have been killed by, ready, their own government. I repeat, their own government. That's right, R.J. Rummell talks about the death from people's own governments in the 20th century. And the reason why this is so important is because up to 300 million people were killed by their own government in the 20th century alone. Now, his estimate is that there's about 170 million people is kind of a middle ground estimate of how many people have been killed by their own government in the 20th century alone, although he thinks it could be upwards of 300 million. So whether it's 170 million people or 300 million people killed by their own government, that is a very big number. And by the way, just some of the examples, I'll put a link to his work down below. All of you should be familiar with this work of R.J. Rummell. He talks about Japan. He talks about the Khmer Rouge, Cambodia, Turkey. He talks about Vietnam. He talks about in Poland, Pakistani, the Pakistani cutthroat state is what he says, Tito's communist Yugoslavia. Obviously, we talk about North Korea, Russia, the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, and so on. Again, he has a very exhaustive list of all this and discussions of all this. I'll put a link to it, and you can check it out for yourself. But the bottom line is this. The people in America, including those in New Hampshire, may be well-intentioned. They may really believe in their heart of hearts that getting rid of guns in American society is a good idea. But as far as I'm concerned, history tells us it's not a good idea. Our founding fathers understood it was not a good idea. That's why they made it the Second Amendment in the Bill of Rights, along with such other fundamental rights, such as the right to free press, the right to free speech, the right to private property, the Fifth Amendment, and so on. So whether we want to take our lessons from R.J. Rummell's statistical work about the hundreds of millions of people killed by their own government, or the apocryphal quote about those who hammer their guns into plows will plow for those who do not, or whether we want to take the lesson from the gods of the copybook headings from Rudyard Kipling when the poem was published in 1919, or just our own common sense and understanding, including but not limited to the famous work of Joseph Story, one of our earliest Supreme Court justices who wrote the first commentaries on the U.S. Constitution, and specifically laid out that the right to bear arms and an armed citizenry are the palladium of our republic. Regardless of where you want to turn to, the reality is that we understand that a lot of people in the anti-gun movement don't want you and I to have guns, but they certainly want our government to have guns. And having a government that has firearms and the citizenry not having firearms, to me, is a prescription for potential disaster. I'm not saying that always occurs, but it certainly is possible. And when you have an armed citizenry, it makes it impossible to do the sorts of things that R.J. Rummell writes about, because it's just not possible for that kind of tyranny and oppression to come upon a society. And while we may sit here today and say, oh, that would never happen, well, that would mean we would be lying to ourselves, because we would be ignoring history. And on this channel at the Four Boxes Diner, as you know, it is my job to make you the smartest person in the room, and I don't care who else is in that room with you. It could be the PhDs. It could be fancy-dancy lawyers with fancy-dancy degrees. It doesn't matter. I'm going to try to make you smarter than all of them when it comes to the Second Amendment history, and these kinds of critical lessons. And today is an example of this. I've tried to give you a lot of broad-based information going back in time, and hopefully you'll retain it and use it to advance our right to keep and bear arms, because without the right to keep and bear arms, we no longer are citizens. We become serfs and subjects. And frankly, that's not anything I think we want here in the United States. Okay, hope you enjoyed today's show. If you haven't subscribed to the Four Boxes Diner, please do so. We'll see you again soon here at the Four Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.